Hello, Poop Coven. Welcome back to the Smut Hut, and we are on episode 2 of the Good Girls Club. So for anyone who is wanting a recap of the first 3 chapters from Manacled, I'm going to give you a little recap, and I'm going to reiterate the trigger warnings that are very important for this book, and then we're going to read chapters 4, 5, and 6 tonight. So, a recap on Manacled. Manacled is a Draco and Hermione fan fiction. It is written post-war. It is what, in my personal opinion, would actually probably really legitimately have happened if the story, OG story, was written for adults. The trigger warnings are extensive, so please, viewer discretion is really advised. Please heed the warnings. Trigger warnings for Manacled are rape, mutilation, forced marriage, degradation, forced breeding, death, war, and suicide. So if any of those things affect you, I highly encourage you to stop listening now. A recap of the first 3 chapters. We discover that Hermione has been held captive in complete and utter sensory deprivation for 16 months. She has not been able to see anything, hear anything. She's been fed and gotten water on a weird schedule, so she had no sense of time. And during that time, she focused on 2 things. She focused on keeping physically fit by working out, and also by doing something she wasn't fully aware she was doing, which was a kind of occlumency, where she takes the memories, her most precious memories, not of her family or the happy times with her and Harry and Ron, not those, but the memories of after Harry died. Because we find out in chapters 1 through 3 that pretty much Harry, all of the Weasleys, Professor McGonagall, Lupin, Tonks, amongst others, have all been murdered by Death Eaters. She created a system of layering her memories to protect them. In this world and in the OG Harry Potter world, there's something called legamins, and that is when someone can invade your memories, and that is what Voldemort is proficient at. So without Hermione consciously being aware, during her duration, she had manacles on her that prevented her from doing any wandless magic or really magic at all, other than internalizing her magic and creating what they called almost like little pearls, hardened memories that Voldemort himself couldn't even crack. We then find out there's a new player in town. It's a doctor. You'll find out more about her. They created a breeding program. Voldemort and his Death Eaters, pure-blooded wizards, are dying out because it's basically incest. We know that doesn't work. So they created a breeding program with the women, only the women that have been held captive in Hogwarts ever since Voldemort has basically taken over. We have been introduced to some of the characters that were, previously, like Hannah Abbott. These women are now basically were brainwashed into being a breeding mare, for lack of a better way, and they are now going to be assigned to a Death Eater to basically just be there for procreation. Hermione was assigned to somebody named the High Reeve, and we are now literally starting chapter 4 with Hermione, who has now been mentally conditioned from Umbridge to obey, be silent, be willing, and do what you are told. And she has now literally grabbed her portkey and is being whisked away to go to the High Reeve's house. The High Reeve is the right-hand man of Voldemort. And that's where we left off. So we are going to begin chapter 4. And we're really about to start what is going to be a very hard journey for our dear Hermione. So, chapter 4. Hermione reappeared in a dark foyer. It was an immaculate, empty room. A black, lacquered, circular table sat in the center of the room. There was a large bouquet of white flowers on the table. She turned slowly. She didn't want to miss any details, but the stupid wings of the bonnet acted like blinders. She could only see straight ahead. A large stairway lay to the right. Cold hallways led into darkness and further into the house. It was a manor, an enormous one based on the width of the staircase. Hello, mudblood. A cold voice made her freeze. Slowly turning all the way around, she found Draco Malfoy. He was older. Her last memory of him was 5th year, when he was on the Inquisitorial squad. He had grown taller. He towered over her, and his face had lost every trace of boyishness. There was a dangerous, refined brutality in the way he held himself, the way he looked at her. His eyes were like a wolf's, cold and feral. The deadliness in him was palpable. As he looked down at her, she felt certain he could lean forward and cut her throat while staring into her eyes, then step back, only caring that she got blood on his shoes. He was the High Reeve, Voldemort's right hand, his executioner. The number of her friends that he had murdered: Ginny, McGonagall, Moody, Neville, Dean, Seamus, Professor Sprout, Madame Pomfrey, Flitwick, Oliver Wood. The list went on and on. Aside from those who had been tortured to death immediately after the final battle, every person that she knew to be dead following the war, the High Reeve had killed them. The girls had whispered to her during the first few nights, telling her about the world of horror she had missed while locked under Hogwarts. She hadn't thought he could be someone she knew, someone so young. Terror welled up inside her. She wasn't sure what to do to handle the shock. Before she could react or even process the realization, his eyes locked into hers, and he abruptly slammed his way into her mind. The force almost made her black out. His mental intrusion was like a blade, driving straight into her memories. He sliced through the fragile barrier then that she tried to erect with the shreds of internal magic she could summon. He drilled into her blocked memories. It was like having a nail driven into her head. The precision and the unrelenting force. He wouldn't stop trying to break through. It felt almost worse than the Cruciatus curse. It lasted longer than the torture curse could without driving the recipient insane. When he finally stopped, she found herself lying on the ground. Malfoy was standing over her, staring down at her as she shuddered from the trauma of his intrusion. "So, you really have forgotten everything," he said as he appraised her. "What is it that you think you're protecting that brain of yours? You lost the war." She couldn't answer. She had no answer. "Oh well," he said, straightening his robe slightly. "The Dark Lord was kind enough to send you to me. If you ever do recover your memories, I'll be the first to know." He smirked down at her for a moment before his face grew cold and indifferent. Then he stepped over her body and walked out of the room. Hermione dragged herself to her feet, shaking from the mental anguish and impotent rage she felt. She hated him. She had never hated Draco Malfoy more. He had simply been an indoctrinated bully, a symptom of a disease which others were responsible for. Now, she hated him for what he had become, for what he had done. He owned her. She was trapped under his heel, and he intended to grind her down until he had what he wanted. She clenched her jaw as she forced herself to think past her sudden rage. Her plan remained the same. She had to find a way to escape or trick him into killing her. He wasn't what she expected. She had hoped that the High Reeve would be driven by emotions, and although the Malfoy she had known in school had been, now he seemed ice cold. Which, of course, she should have realized. Legamency, occlumency. The key to them was control, the ability to compartmentalize oneself behind walls. It would take cunning to make him snap enough to make a mistake like killing her. Whatever she did, she wouldn't be able to accomplish it immediately. She couldn't rush it. She could not be careless. She would have to stay there, wait, and endure what was to come until she found an opening. The thought had her shuddering. Her throat felt tight as she swallowed and tried to think. A click of heels on the wood floor drew her attention. A petite blonde witch swept into the room. She and Hermione stared at each other for several long minutes. "So, you're it," the witch said, elevating her nose with a sniff. "Take that stupid hat off and come along. We have to review the instructions all together before I could put you away where we're going to keep you." The blonde turned on her heel and marched back out of the room. Hermione followed slowly. The witch was familiar. A green grass, Hermione thought. Not Daphne, but maybe the younger sister? Hermione couldn't remember her name. They arrived in a drawing room. Malfoy was already there, reclining in a spindly-looking chair, and looked bored. Hermione pulled the bonnet off. So, said the witch Hermione assumed must be Malfoy's wife, as she seated herself on one of the other spindly chairs. Healer Stroud sent over a package of instructions. Who knew mudbloods came with directions? So convenient, isn't it? The sarcasm in the witch's sharp little voice was brittle. Just read it, Astoria, Malfoy said, glancing briefly toward the witch with a sneer. Astoria, that was the name of Malfoy's wife. Let's see. No cursing or torturing or physically abusing her. She's to be kept fed. We can make her work, but no more than 6 hours a day. And she's to spend at least an hour outside each day. Astoria laughed somewhat maniacally. It's rather like keeping crumps, isn't it? Who knew? Ah, yes. How delightful. We'll get an owl every month on the 5 days you're required to perform, Draco. Healer Stroud has included a little personal note here mentioning that due to the Dark Lord's specific interest in Malfoy family and the Mudblood, she'll be coming in person every month to see whether you're successful. Astoria looked so nearly hysterical that Hermione was surprised she hadn't literally started screaming and smashing a chair. Listen to this. I'm allowed to watch, to make sure everything is entirely clinical between you and the Mudblood. Astoria turned shockingly pale. Her blue eyes almost looked deranged. Her hands were shaking, and she crumpled up the papers in her hands and smacked them down on the tea table. I will not, she said, her voice razor-edged and vibrating. If you object, you could drag me in front of the Dark Lord himself before you avada me. I will not watch. She did not scream the last bit. Do what you wish. Just shut up, Malfoy said, his tone vicious as he stood up and strode from the room. Hermione stood frozen near the wall. Astoria sat shaking in her chair for several minutes before she spoke to Hermione. My mother bred crumps. Pretty little things, Astoria said. Such fun to see it done now with wizards. Hermione said nothing. She just stood by the wall, trying not to move, willing her fingers not to spasm. I am pretending to be a tree, she thought faintly to herself. Finally, Astoria stood up. I'll show you to your room. You can do whatever you want, but I don't want to see you. I understand that those bracelets you have keep you from any trouble, right? They went down a long hallway and then through a narrow, partly concealed door that led to a winding servants' stairway. After ascending 3 floors, they re-entered into a larger main hallway of the house. They were in a different wing. The windows were all heavily draped. It was cold and shrouded, the furniture all covered with white dust sheets. This wing is unoccupied, Astoria said as though it weren't obvious. We have more servants than we need. Stay here and out of sight unless you're called for. The portraits will keep an eye on you. Astoria pushed open a door. Hermione walked in. It was a large bedroom. A canopied bed sat in the center and a single wing-back chair near the window. A large wardrobe sat against one wall. There was no rug. A portrait hung on the wall. No books. Everything was cold and bare. Everything was cold and bare. If you need anything, call a house elf, Astoria said before pulling the door shut. Hermione listened to her retreating footsteps. Being suddenly left unsupervised without being in a cell felt disorienting. The sudden change simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, as though she suddenly jumped off a cliff. She dropped her bonnet on the floor next to the door and walked over to a window. The cold, wintry countryside stretched out as far as she could see. As she took it in, she considered the situation. Malfoy and Astoria clearly disliked each other. It was hardly surprising, as if pure-blood arranged marriages weren't already dysfunctional enough. Having them arranged by Voldemort for the sole purpose of reproduction had to have smothered any potential spark, especially after they failed to reproduce. Astoria did not seem particularly afraid of Malfoy, so presumably he wasn't so short-tempered as to be violent to her. She seemed largely resentful of him and indifferent to him. He did not appear to be an attentive husband by any stretch of the imagination. His regard for Astoria seemed to be along the lines of finding her to be a pest he was obliged to endure. Whatever Astoria may feel about her husband or marriage, Hermione's presence as a surrogate clearly stung. She seemed determined to ignore Hermione's existence as much as she possibly could. Hermione had no objection. The fewer players she had to worry about, the better. If she had to worry about fending off or appeasing Astoria, it would be an additional challenge. If Astoria were attentive to her husband, it would make escaping or finding a way to manipulate Malfoy far more challenging. If Astoria was primarily preoccupied by pretending Hermione didn't exist, it was the easiest of the scenarios. Hermione would keep out of sight in the shadows as much as she could until there was an opportunity to act. The key would be to study Malfoy, discover what drove him, what his vices were, what she could exploit in him. He didn't seem particularly interested in Hermione beyond finding out what she might be concealing in her lost memories. If that were the case, it was a relief. Perhaps he would also primarily choose to leave her alone. She was sure that if he wished to, he could come up with any number of ways to torture her without risking her fertility. Draco Malfoy was the High Reeve. It was still shocking. What had happened to him during the war to make him so ruthless? The hatred required to successfully cast a killing curse was tremendous. To inflict instant death tore something out of you. Most dark wizards and witches could only manage it occasionally. That was part of why there were so many other curses used to kill. Sadism factored into it. But the truth was that no other curse was irreversible and unstoppable the way the killing curse was. The power necessary to utilize something so final was, well, there was really nothing to compare it to. Voldemort's ability to cast it repeatedly and unfailingly was part of the reason he inspired such terror. The High Reeve's reputation for using the curse was already equally legendary. It had vaulted him into the highest rank of the Death Eaters. And it was Malfoy. She would have to move carefully. The casualness with which the Malfoys had treated her arrival indicated utter assurance. Leaving her in the foyer, showing her through the house, putting her into an unoccupied wing, Hermione was certain there was no easy ways to escape. Until she could get the manacles off, Malfoy was always to be able to find her, and she be incapable of fighting off him or anyone else. She sighed, and her breath made a small circle of condensation on the cold glass of the window pane. Lifting a fingertip to the glass, she drew the rune for defense, introspection, and focus. Beside it, she drew a reversal, a Merkstav, for danger, defenselessness, malice, hatred, and spite. What she needed and what she had. She had to reverse her fortune. She watched the runes fade away from the glass on the condensation, evaporated back into the room. None of the girls had heard any whispers about the resistance still existing. Aside from Hermione, all of the Order members who survived the final battle were known to be dead. Their deaths publicly witnessed, their corpses hung up to ensure there was no room for secret hopes. The resistance had crumbled upon Harry's death. Voldemort appeared to have been very careful about ensuring that the Order of the Phoenix had no spark with which to resurrect itself. As the war had dragged on over the years, he had grown more cautious and less certain about his infallibility than he had been during Hermione's years in Hogwarts. Voldemort was thorough. That was troubling. If he had elevated Malfoy to High Reeve, it probably meant that Malfoy was also thorough. Not someone inclined to make mistakes or errors in judgment. Maybe there was still a resistance somewhere. The woman at Hogwarts had only known what the guards told them. There might still be some factions working against Voldemort. If Hermione escaped, maybe she could find them and eventually give them whatever secret she was hiding. Since she was in the High Reeve's home, perhaps if she were clever, she'd be able to glean useful information. If she kept acting pliant and cooperative. Broken. If they thought she was truly broken, they might eventually become careless around her. She would be waiting for it. She was very good at waiting. So, that is the end of chapter 4. I I repeat, we have just finished chapter 4. Thank you so much, Sarah, for the raid. I will say that what we are doing right now is you are in the Smut Hut. We are currently reading Manacled. It is a dark romance surrounding Draco and Hermione. There are extensive trigger warnings, so please read them and be aware as we continue on in the story. If you would like to catch up, chapters 1 through 3 are on our YouTube. Addie, if you could, or Naroobs, if you could throw that in chat. But we're gonna keep going. We're gonna get on to chapter 5. And again, thank you so much, Sarah, for the raid. Please heed the warnings. It's hardcore. All right, and we're gonna keep going. Chapter 5. Thank you again, Sarah. I love your guts. Hermione explored the room she had been placed in. There was little to it that hadn't immediately met the eye. The wardrobe was filled with more of the same scarlet dresses and robes that she was currently wearing. They were in various weights, presumably for summer and winter weather. The drawers held more bonnets and woolen socks, more flimsy red shoes. Hermione pulled a pair out of the drawer and stared at them. The soles were thin and they were fabric. They would wear through rapidly. If she wanted to run, she'd have to steal new clothes and shoes. The portrait on the wall was of a young witch, pretty and blonde, undoubtedly one of Malfoy's ancestors. She had the same sharp features and disdainful expression. The witch couldn't have been more than just graduated from Hogwarts when she was painted. She stared indifferently at Hermione, seated casually in a high-backed chair, a book beside her. Eventually, Hermione turned away and surveyed the rest of the room. There was a door designed to blend into the wall across the room. She went over and opened it. A bathroom, primarily occupied by a large clawfoot tub, no shower. Nothing but the most essential objects were provided: soap, towels, a toothbrush, and a small cup of water. Hermione walked over and washed her hands. As she withdrew them, she pretended to accidentally knock the cup off the counter. It hit the ground with a loud, sharp sound, but failed to break or even crack. There was a protection charm on it. Malfoy was thorough. She picked it up and rinsed it before replacing it. As she turned, she found that there was a portrait in the bathroom as well. The same young witch stood studying Hermione with a knowing look. Hermione feigned innocence and walked back into the bedroom. Within an hour, there was nothing left to possibly inspect in her room. Not that Hermione expected she could find anything or get into much trouble with the piercing supervision of the portrait on the wall. The witch had apparently ordered to watch Hermione like a hawk. Hermione went to the door of the bedroom and, after a moment's hesitation, she turned the knob and walked into the hallway. Her heart immediately began pounding. The sense of terror and freedom that she had experienced by merely walking into another room by herself was staggering. As she pulled the door shut behind herself, she leaned against the door and tried to take a slow breath. Her fingers twitched around the doorknob as she glanced around and tried to compose herself. The long hallway that vanished into darkness felt so open. She swallowed nervously. She had assumed some effects of her long imprisonment would continue to haunt her. Actually experiencing it was more than unsettling. It was horrifying. Her attempts to breathe and calm down were failing. Her chest stuttered in tiny, rapid inhalations, the only sound in the cold, dark wing of the entire manor. She bit her lip. Her mind. Had she always been able to trust her mind? Even her locked memories felt like a defense mechanism. Finding herself panicking and hyperventilating because she had walked into a hallway of her own volition. This was a betrayal. She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to breathe evenly. Tried to pull her hand free from the doorknob she was clutching desperately, as though she would drown if she let it go. Her ability to reason and tell herself she was all right was insufficient. Insufficient persuasion to her mind and body. She tried to make herself step away from the door, but her legs refused to cooperate. The terror coursing through her body had her frozen. It was a hallway. Just a hallway, she told herself. She was allowed to be there. There were no commands holding her back. There were no commands holding her back. Just herself. After standing there for several minutes, trying and failing to force herself to move, she abruptly sobbed and huddled closer to the door. She couldn't remember the last time she had cried. Long ago in her cell, as she stood there shaking and hyperventilating in the hallway of that empty wing of the manor, she cried over everyone who was dead now, for everyone Malfoy had killed, for all the girls back at Hogwarts being sent out into this world of horror. Out of rage over the manacles locked around her wrists, and the manacles she found she had somehow locked around her own mind. She went back into her room, closed the door, sank onto the floor, and just kept crying. It took her a full day before she could force herself into the hallway again. She was determined to make herself overcome this panic. The next morning, she opened the door wide, crouched on the bed, and made herself stare at the hallway until her heart stopped pounding painfully in her chest from the mere sight. She would lose all chance of escape if she couldn't even walk out of her room without having a mental breakdown. She sat in bed and ate the breakfast that appeared while she contemplated the problem. It had manifested when she was alone. She wasn't sure if it was because the manacle's compulsion to be obedient had previously distracted her from it, or if it were an insidious form of mental trauma, that being imprisoned for so long had damaged her to the point that being controlled by others was the only way she knew how to function now. She hoped it was simply the manacles, but she feared it was the latter. Imprisonment had eaten away at her psyche in ways she felt afraid to fully realize. She steeled herself. She was determined to overcome it, whatever it took. When her dinner appeared that evening, she made herself eat it while sitting by the open door. Her hands shook so much she dropped half of the food from her fork. By the time she finished eating, the trembling in them had eased enough that she could drink water without spilling it down her front. She stared down the hallway. She stared at all the shrouded furniture and the many portraits of cold-faced, pale aristocrats. She tried to remember what she knew of Malfoy. How had he managed to climb so high in Voldemort's rank at such a young age? He had been involved in Dumbledore's death at the beginning of 6th year. The circumstances of that had never been entirely clear. She remembered being awakened abruptly by the castle's screaming wards during the aftermath. Minerva McGonagall and the rest of the professors had been pale with shock and horror as they frantically tried to discover what had happened. Malfoy vanished in the chaos. It was the first and last major event of the war that Hermione associated specifically with Malfoy. After that, he disappeared into Voldemort's rank. Another faceless Death Eater. His mother had died several years into the war. Hermione remembered hearing about Narcissa Malfoy's death in Lestrange Manor. It had happened during a rescue mission. Harry and Ron had been caught by Snatchers. When the Order went to rescue them, a Death Eater lost control of a fiend fire curse and burned down the manor with Narcissa and Bellatrix inside of it. Narcissa's death had driven Lucius Malfoy insane. He had slid easily into Bellatrix's vacated shoes of madness. He placed the blame for Narcissa's death squarely on Ron and Harry and devoted himself to avenging her by hunting down the Weasleys. Arthur Weasley's brain damage and the near death of George during the war had both been caused by Lucius. He became a loose cannon within Voldemort's ranks. He'd been too useful and deadly for his insubordination to get him killed, but he'd constantly danced on the line. And it occurred to Hermione that Lucius might have been the High Reeve, given how vicious, hate-filled, and quick to murder he was. Since he wasn't, Hermione wondered if he was even still alive. Perhaps following the war, he had finally overstepped and gotten himself killed. Hermione had hoped so. The way Lucius had laughed while Ron died screaming in agony. Hermione would never banish the memory. But Malfoy? She didn't think he'd been treated as particularly important or considered a significant Death Eater during the Order meeting she recalled. Whatever he'd done to claw his way to the very top must have occurred toward the end of the war. Perhaps he had been involved with whatever caused the Order's plans during the final battle to fall apart. Because she'd been a healer, Hermione hadn't been there for the entire battle. Something in their strategy had gone wrong. There had been far more Death Eaters than the Order had anticipated. Voldemort had cast a killing curse, and Harry had fallen. Then he commanded Lucius to confirm Harry was dead. Harry hadn't been dead. So Voldemort cast another killing curse, and another, and another, and another. After half a dozen killing curses, Voldemort had gone and confirmed for himself that Harry was dead. For insurance, he had Harry's body dragged up into the air and hung from the astronomy tower. Everyone watched as Voldemort cursed Harry's body with a fast-acting necrosis curse, and the entire thing rotted away before their very eyes. Harry's blank green eyes. Hermione saw them every time she closed her own. The expression on his face, the realization that he had failed, had been written into it even in death. Hermione shook as she thought about it. Her best friend had died before her very eyes. By some extra cruel twist of the fate, she hadn't been allowed to follow them. They had left her behind. She squared her shoulders and forced herself to step into the hallway. She had faced all manner of horror. She wasn't going to be defeated by her own fractured psyche in a hallway. 1 step. 2. 3. 4. Her breathing grew fainter. She clenched her hand into fists until she could feel her nails sinking into the skin. 5. 6. 7. Drip. 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 She froze and looked down. One of her hands was dripping blood into a trail on the floor. It was the same shade as her dress. She stared down at it until a puddle the size of a nut gradually collected by her feet. Then she continued down the hall. She counted the dripping sounds instead of her footsteps until she reached the end. She had no destination in mind, so she turned around and started back, trying the knobs of the doors along the way. Some were locked, others weren't. She peeked into more empty bedrooms filled with shrouded furniture. She would return and explore them all carefully later. Perhaps something that might prove useful would be found in them. She was shaking as she re-entered her room. Feeling drained, she immediately crawled into bed. As she fell asleep, she dreamed of Ginny. Ginny. From near the end of the war, with hair cut above her shoulders and a long, cruel scar down the side of her face. She was huddled next to a bed and looked up sharply at Hermione as though startled. Ginny's expression was twisted in anguish, covered in tears. She was sobbing uncontrollably. "Ginny," Hermione heard herself say. "Ginny, what's wrong? What happened?" As Ginny opened her mouth to answer, the dream faded away. When Hermione woke the next morning, she knew she must have been dreaming. What had she been dreaming of? She couldn't remember. Something sad. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and tried to remember it. She couldn't bring herself to go near the door that day. She huddled by the window and looked out at the misty gardens that lay outside. There was a hedge maze to one side. She traced her way through it with her eyes. She studied all the grounds of the estate that she could see, trying to take note of anything that could be useful. Where would she go if she was trying to hide, if she were trying to escape? The day passed slowly. Having a sense of time once again was vaguely unsettling. Steady ticking of the clock constantly caught her attention. A continuous grating sound. If she let herself listen to it for long, it made her fingers begin to spasm with each click of the gears. She found that her mind had a tendency toward wandering and losing itself. She would interrupt herself from some odd thought and realize hours had passed. As the day grew to a close, she stared at the door. She should make herself go out again. She hadn't even seen Malfoy since she had arrived. She had intended to try to watch him, study him, arm herself with some kind of understanding of him. All those plans had faded away during the last 2 days. She stood up and moved slowly towards the door. As she was wrapping her fingers around the knob, there was a sudden pop behind her. Starting, she turned sharply and found a house elf standing behind her. "You is ready for tonight, Mistress is saying," the elf said, averting its eyes and then popping away. Hermione felt as though her heart were in her throat. Her hand started trembling. She considered for a moment, not readying herself. Undoubtedly, if she did, Malfoy would appear and force her to. Who knew what else he might do to her if she provoked him? The compulsions in her mind stirred. Obedient. Not to resist. Her brain automatically began cataloging the things she had been instructed to do. She wasn't sure if the compulsion made her rationalize obeying or if obeying actually was the rational choice. She went into the bathroom and turned on the tap water. The scalding water poured out and she watched the tub slowly fill. She wondered if she could somehow drown herself before Malfoy could get here. As Lord of the Manor, he could probably apparate anywhere. She shuddered at the thought of having him drag her naked out of the water by her hair. She pulled off her robes and sank into the water, hissing but relishing the pain. She hardly felt anything nowadays. Apparently, the manacles didn't restrict her from heat. That was a useful piece of information to file away. After she had washed, she dried herself with the lavish, oversized bath towel. Then she pulled on a fresh set of robes, the long scarlet button dress and then the open scarlet robe. Then she pulled on the stockings. She hated them so much. If it weren't freezing inside the manor, she never would have worn them. Aside from the dreadful red color, she could almost pretend that the robes were just clothing, but the horrid crotchlessness left her feeling constantly exposed. She would only get her knickers off if she was bleeding or pregnant. Otherwise, she was to remain accessible. She would only get her underwear if she was bleeding or pregnant. Otherwise, she was to remain accessible. When she was dressed, she stood uncertainly in the middle of her room. She wasn't sure where she was supposed to go, what she was supposed to do. The door abruptly swung open and Astoria appeared, looking white as a sheet. Good. You're ready. I'm afraid I have to send Draco to drag you, Astoria said as she glanced up and down Hermione with a critical expression. I'll show you where to go tonight. After this, I shall be elsewhere. I expect you to prepare and go there every designated night without issue. I was realizing you really don't need all the body parts you have just in order to reproduce. So if you're thinking of causing problems, keep that in mind. A chill ran down Hermione's spine, but she nodded. Astoria swept from the room, leading Hermione through the house, out into the foyer, and then up the large staircase and down a second-floor hallway. The portrait muttered as they passed by. Whore. Hermione heard it muttered more than once. Astoria stopped at the seventh door. Go in and wait. Draco will come when he chooses, but you're to be there at 8 o'clock sharp. Without pausing further, Astoria continued down the hallway and disappeared into the darkness. Hermione's hands were trembling as she grasped the doorknob and tried to open it. It wouldn't turn at first, and she had to take several deep breaths to calm herself and make her hand stop shaking enough to grasp it and turn it. Stepping into the room, she took in every detail she could. It felt sterile. She had assumed her room was bare and cold out of indifference, but perhaps it was simply the way Malfoy was. There was a large bed, a towering wardrobe, a desk, and a chair. Hermione would have imagined Malfoy as having a more luxurious room, all green and silver with expensive sheets and throw pillows covered with too many tassels. The room before her could have belonged to a monk. It was functional. That was really all she could say about it. No wonder Malfoy was so cold. She shied away from the bed and went over to the chair by the desk. Sitting down, she looked over the contents of the desk's surface, blank parchment and quills. She held out her hand out hesitantly towards the quills, wondering if she was able to touch them. As her fingers got close, she felt a faint burning sensation and pulled her hand back. Her stomach was twisting itself with dread as she tried to distract herself by reciting arithmetic formulas while she sat there. She was used to waiting endlessly. Was an hour after 16 months of sensory deprivation that big a deal? She just needed to stop thinking about what was about to happen next. Her stomach felt so twisted she thought she might be sick. Suddenly, the door clicked. She stood and turned sharply in time to see Malfoy stride in. His hand was up at his throat, pulling his collar loose. He clearly had not expected to find her there. He stopped abruptly and stared at her, actually seeming to pale slightly before pressing his lips together into a hard line. Mudblood, he said after a moment. Today is the day, I see. Okay, we are about to start chapter 6. I am warning you, please heed the trigger warnings. Please know this has forced breeding, rape, mutilation, It is a beautiful story, but it's gonna take a minute and you're not gonna understand how it could possibly be beautiful, but I assure you I wouldn't read it to you if it wasn't. Please prepare yourselves. We're about to start chapter 6 of Manacled. It is very Handmaid's Tale, absolutely Handmaid's Tale. This is the final chapter we are reading before we finish the second episode of the Good Girls Club. I repeat, please prepare yourself. Why are we yelling? Because I want everyone to hear me before we start this chapter. We are reading Manacled. We are about to begin chapter 6. Okay. Thank you, Dale. Hermione didn't say anything. Chapter 6. Hermione didn't say anything. She just looked at him. She was relieved she wasn't trembling. She forced herself to meet his gaze, reminding herself she just had to endure for a little while, just until she could formulate a plan. She could endure it. She would. She was uncertain of what she was supposed to do. Was he expecting her to go lie down on the bed? He strode past her to the wardrobe after laying his hand against the door for a moment and jerked it open. Perhaps Malfoy was not entirely monk-like. The wardrobe had almost an entire room within it. The door held a full bar, and Malfoy snatched a bottle of fire whiskey off a shelf and pulled the cork out of his teeth. Spitting the cork onto the floor, he raised the bottle to his lips and stared at her. Hermione just waited. After a minute, he drew his wand with a quick movement, conjured a table in the middle of the floor. Hermione stared at it, completely at a loss. She looked over to Malfoy. He sneered at her. "Bend over," he said in a low, taunting voice, gesturing toward it. Hermione hadn't thought she could feel any more repulsed by him, but apparently she could. She bit down on the side of her lip until she felt the skin give way and blood flow over her tongue as she felt her feet begin to obey automatically. She walked slowly over and, after hesitating for a moment, leaned across the table. The wood bit into her hip bones. She rested her hands against the edges and gripped them until her knuckles cracked from the force. She fought to keep them from trembling. Her whole body felt on edge from the intensity of her vulnerability. Her ears were straining to detect any sound. There was a pause. Then she heard Malfoy approach her slowly. He stopped directly behind her, and there was another silence. She could feel his eyes on her. The air shifted. "Are you still a virgin, Mudblood? Is that something you even remember?" She flinched as she realized she didn't know. He stepped closer. I'm sure Weasley or Potter climbed up there at some point. She could hear the mockery in his tone. His hand rested briefly on the small of her back as he pulled her skirts up to her waist. She felt the cold air of his room against her skin. She was shaking so hard the table was rattling. "Well, I suppose we'll know soon enough," he said, and then commanded, "Move your feet wider." She forced herself to shift. She felt his fingers on her and jerked away slightly. He muttered under his breath, and she felt something warm and liquid inside her, a lubrication charm. She started so abruptly, the table legs shrieked as they dragged across the wood floor. "We can't have any damage or infections impairing your usefulness," he explained in a derisive tone. She heard his belt click, and then, without warning, he impaled her with himself. She tried to bite back the sob that forced its way up her throat, but the abrupt invasion caught her off guard. At her cry, he froze just for a moment before he started moving again. Aside from where they were joined, he did not touch her. His right hand gripped the table near where her face was turned. She could see a black ring on his hand, glittering faintly. When he came, his movements grew uneven and rougher, and then he stilled suddenly with a quiet hiss. He stayed there for only a second before jerking away from her and striding back over to the bar. "Get out!" His tone was sharp. Hermione shook. I can't." She tried not to sob as she said, but her voice trembled. I'm not allowed to move for 10 minutes after." He snarled with rage. Suddenly, the table beneath her vanished and she plummeted to the floor, hitting her forehead sharply on the ground. "Get out!" The room shook, Pushing herself up, she fled, stumbling dazed through the hallway, trying to remember her way back. Her chest was stuttering as she tried not to hyperventilate. She couldn't see clearly. She reached up to find that her forehead had split where she'd hit it. Blood was streaming down into her eyes. She stood at the top of the stairs, trying to remember her way back. Blood was filling her eyes. She could feel fluid seeping out from between her legs, trickling down her thighs. She was shaking, trying to remember where her room was. If she stayed there, Astoria would find her and gouge her eyes out, or chop off her fingers, or pull out her teeth. She stumbled and almost fell down the stairs. She was drawing short, rapid breaths as she tried to keep from sobbing aloud. She couldn't understand. She'd survived the war. She'd watched her friends die in front of her. She stayed sane, alone, in a dark cell for over a year. But being forced to be complicit in her own rape, she couldn't bear it. Not while knowing she'd be expected to do it again the next day, and the next, and the day after that. She stared dizzily down the foyer. If she threw herself over the balcony, Malfoy couldn't stop her. She'd be done. She leaned over and looked down at the table in the foyer, just a little further. A vice-like grip closed itself around her arm and wrenched her away. She turned and found Malfoy glaring at her in rage. "Don't you dare." He snarled the words, his face white with fury. "Please, Malfoy," she was sobbing. "Please." He dragged her down the stairs and through the house as she cried. He practically kicked the door of her room in as he dragged her into it and shoved her into it. "Avancio!" he snapped, pointing his wand at her face, and suddenly the blood in her eyes vanished. He followed it with a healing charm and just stood there, staring at her with unveiled fury. "Do you really think I won't know when you try to kill yourself, mudblood?" he finally asked after she stopped sobbing. "Just let me," she said. Her voice was wooden. Her chest kept stuttering. "I'm sure they'll give you a new mudblood to breed. You hate me too, Malfoy. Do you really want me to be the mother of your children? To see my face in them? I'm sure you could come up with a compelling excuse for killing me." Malfoy gave a barking laugh. "If it were only so easy, I'd have killed you by now. For the first time in your life, you appear to have underestimated your value. The Dark Lord is quite anxious to see what kind of offspring will reproduce. Once you've birthed a few heirs for me, he intends to send you on and see what kind you'll make for some other old wizarding families. Your little broodmares are quite the commodity. The Dark Lord has a whole breeding program planned, spanning several generations." Hermione stared in horror. He moved closer, his expression menacing. "Let's not forget about those memories of yours. The fact that there was something you considered worth hiding, even after losing the war, is a cause for concern. Until I know why, you will not die. However, how much freedom you have in this house, and how often I have to supervise you in order to assure it, your little suicide contemplations will decide that." Hermione sat there frozen. Somehow she'd assumed that Malfoy would be the end of her, that he'd force a child from her, and then she'd be disposed of. It hadn't occurred to her that she was intended to go on from one wizarding family after another until her body gave out. Malfoy glanced around her room and then back to her. Her face was tense and his eyes steely. "Well," he said, sighing, "I hadn't intended to do this immediately after fucking you the first time, but I am already here and with no further plans for the evening. There really is no time like the present. Let's see exactly what is going on in that little mudblood head of yours, huh? How many other ideas do you have?" Before she could cringe away, he used his wand tip to force her chin up. His cold, gray eyes sank into her consciousness. He didn't bother with her locked memories. He went directly after the war to her imprisonment and moved from there. Hermione didn't struggle. If she tried to push him out, it would just hurt more, and he would still force his way through. She collapsed onto the bed as the weight of his mind bore into hers. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, but she was otherwise still. He slipped quickly through all the long, silent, isolated months and then moved slowly once she was dragged out of the cell, tortured, petrified, and then re-tortured by not being stunned when immobilized again. He took note of her conversation with Hannah and the mind healer's description of Hermione's condition. He observed the techniques Voldemort and Snape had used to try to break into her locked memories. He was particularly interested in her scheming to kill herself or escape. She could feel his condescending amusement at who she had theorized the High Reeve could be, how she had wondered if she could take advantage of him and get him killed. Hermione couldn't find a way to wrench the thoughts away from him or conceal them. Every time she was able to gather more than a shred of magic, she felt the copper of the manacles key in and snatch it away. He paid careful attention to the manacles, the compulsions that had been laid, the screaming girl who snapped and nearly bludgeoned someone to death, to Hermione's arrival at the manor and reaction upon seeing him, to her theories regarding himself and Astoria, then her careful exploration of her room and panic attacks when she tried to step into the hallway. It took hours. He pored over every detail, all the twists, doubts, questions, and theories in her mind. Finally, when he reached her memory of Astoria sweeping into the bedroom to retrieve her for that evening, he withdrew. He was apparently disinterested by the notion of witnessing her perspective of being raped by him. Hermione felt as though her skull had been crushed. She barely even twitched as he stood staring down at her. "So many schemes," he said as he straightened and tilted his head back, appraising her with cold, mocking eyes. "Then again, I feel disappointed if you weren't entertaining at least one plot to try to kill me and escape. I can't wait to see what you come up with next." He leaned over the bed until his cruel face was only a breath away from hers. "Do you really think you can trick me into killing you?" Hermione dragged her eyes away from his face and stared up at the canopy. "Do feel free to try," he said with a smirk, "just as soon as you can bring yourself to walk through that door by yourself." Then he straightened again and all the humor vanished from his face. "Stay out of my room. I don't want to find you in there again. I'll come do it in here." He sneered at her. "I'll have a table sent so you'll know when to expect me." He turned on his heel and strode out without another word. Hermione didn't move, not when the door clicked shut. Not as the hands on the clock ticked unrelentingly on, indicating that it was past 3 a.m. Not when she became conscious of the Not as she became conscious of the crusting sensation on her thighs, the faint rawness between her legs, the unfamiliar ache in her lower abdomen. She just lay there. Once upon a time, there had been a girl who fought back, who believed that books and cleverness and friendship and bravery would overcome all things. But now that girl was gone. She'd been all but killed during the war. Now, Draco Malfoy had stomped that girl to dust over the course of just one evening. Hadn't physically and mentally raped every last shred of that girl to death. Hermione lay and stared up at the canopy of the bed. She hadn't laid much more store in her plans. She'd known her odds were impossibly small. Now, Malfoy's mockery had sealed the sense of defeat that she felt. She didn't move. When morning came, she didn't wake. It was late in the afternoon before she finally dragged herself from bed and into a bath. Malfoy had barely touched her, but she scrubbed every inch of herself in an attempt to exorcise any trace of him. In the process, she discovered a thin, raised scar on her rib cage that she couldn't remember getting, as well as a faint cluster of scars mottling her left wrist and upper chest. She inspected them all carefully, but drew a complete blank as to how or when she had received them. She didn't think she'd been injured much during the final battle. She hadn't been in any raids or skirmishes for several years prior to the war ending. As she examined her wrist again, she reviewed in her mind all the curses she knew that might cause such scarring. It was such a long list. Voldemort had created a division in his army specifically devoted to developing new curses. Hermione couldn't remember a battle that hadn't had multiple casualties simply because she couldn't identify all the new curses fast enough to counter them. The water grew cold around her, but she didn't leave until she started shivering. When she went back into the bedroom, she found that lunch had been left for her. She picked listlessly at it. She went to the door and stood trembling in front of it for several minutes before turning away. She stared at the cold, misty Wilshire landscape outside her window. She pressed her forehead against the glass. She relished the sharp, icy pain that sank into her skin. She wished it would sink in far enough to numb her mentally. She didn't know what to do to make She didn't know what to do but make more futile plans. There was nothing else to do. No books to read, nothing to occupy her mind but all those spells and arithmetic problems and potion recipes that she had already recited to herself 1,000 times. She hadn't realized the comforting oblivion that came from not seeing and barely hearing in a timeless nowhere. Standing out in the real world again as a keener sense of despair than even her eventual acceptance of her cell. Realizing how reduced she'd become, how powerless she was to fight her circumstances, finding that no book she'd studied, nor spell she'd learned, offer any solutions for her circumstances. She didn't know how to rise above it. She didn't even know how to get through it. She just wanted to die. Even that felt utterly unattainable. The table appeared in her room at precisely 7:30 that evening. She bathed only a few hours before, and she just stared at it, bracing herself, considering. It was at least impersonal. As humiliating and horrifying as it was, at least she didn't have to look at Malfoy when he did it. She didn't have to touch him. She didn't want to see him. A minute before 8 o'clock, she went over and leaned across the table. She set her feet wide and turned her face so she could watch the clock. When the door clicked, she didn't move. Malfoy didn't say a word. He walked over and paused behind her. Hermione's hands began trembling, but she refused to let herself move. She wouldn't look at him. She squeezed her eyes shut and began to recite healing spells, the longest, most complex ones she knew, rehearsing the wand movement in her mind. Her skirts were pulled up, and she felt the trembling in her hands spread throughout the rest of her body. She heard the muttered charm, warmth and liquid. She gritted her teeth as she felt prodding between her legs. When he sank inside her, she shook but did not cry. When he started to move, she cast her mind for something new, something she hadn't already thought to death. The lines of a poem slowly came to her mind. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro. The continuous sensation of movements inside her dragged her attention back into reality. She ground her teeth and fought for the next lines. She started over. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro. Kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. The pace of movement shifted, and she desperately scrabbled to recall what words came next. That sense was breaking through, and when they were all seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. Malfoy abruptly came as she tried to remember the following line. He pulled away sharply. Hermione didn't move. A moment later, she heard the door click once more. Hermione tried to remember the third verse of the poem, but it floated beyond her memory's reach. She remembered an armchair and a book of poetry, comforting arms wrapped around a child Hermione, a woman's hands flicking to a page, a voice she couldn't remember any longer. Her mother. She thought it might have been her mother who taught her this poem. She opened her eyes and stared up at the clock. That is the end of chapter 6. So, it's going to be rough before it gets better. I promise you I will not read something to you that does not become absolutely wonderful and unbelievable and the best story you'll ever hear. I assure you. I promise. If you would like to watch from the beginning, all of the episodes of the Good Girls Club are on YouTube. Chapters 1 through 3 are on YouTube. And these chapters 4 through 6 of this episode will be on YouTube. The next episode, if you would like to find out what is going to happen and how this is possibly going to turn out, the next chapters will be read next Saturday. So, thank you for staying in the Smut Hut and listening to Manacled in the Good Girls Club. And I'll see you next Saturday for the next episode of the Good Girls Club.